In the history of science, there are many important works, and one of the most important is The Origin of Species. Published in 1859 by the English naturalist Charles Darwin, this book set forth the basic ideas of evolution. This book changed our understanding of nature and humans and became one of the cornerstones of modern biology. In the mid-19th century, Darwin discovered the diversity of biological species and the regularity of their distribution in the natural world. After a long period of observation and study, he developed his understanding of evolution and published his book The Origin of Species in 1859. This book describes how organisms have evolved to produce diversity and how they have adapted to changing environments through natural selection. In the book, Darwin introduced the concept of natural selection. He argues that competition among organisms and changes in the environment result in organisms with certain characteristics being more likely to survive and reproduce, and that these characteristics are passed on, eventually leading to the evolution of species. This mechanism, known as natural selection, has become one of the central concepts of evolutionary theory. Other evolutionary mechanisms, such as genetic drift and sexual selection, are also described in The Origin of Species. Darwin supports his theory of evolution with a variety of evidence, such as biogeography and comparative anatomy. He also explains many seemingly miraculous or implausible phenomena, such as the similarities between whales and birds, and the similarities between humans and hominids. Darwin's theory of evolution is not only an important milestone in biology, but also a highly inspirational and influential scientific idea. Evolution has changed the way we see ourselves and the world, and has driven the development of biology, anthropology, psychology, and other disciplines. Today, evolution remains an important area of study in the scientific community and has influenced our understanding of the natural world and human beings. Darwin began by identifying the genetic and phenotypic differences in organisms that underlie variation. He explains how genetic variation occurs, including the processes of sexual reproduction, mutation, and genetic drift. He also pointed out the role and importance of variation as providing the material basis for natural selection. Genetic variation in sexual reproduction of organisms is the basis of natural selection because it provides the diversity to adapt to the environment. In addition, Darwin explores many different types of variation, including genetic variation, environmental variation, sexual selection, and the effects of natural selection on variation. He also discusses the limitations of variation and some of the limiting factors such as genome size, phenotypic plasticity, and the rate of natural selection. Variation is the basis of biological evolution, and the diversity of phenotypic traits produced through variation provides natural selection, which is one of the key mechanisms of biological evolution. The theory of selection is the core of Darwin's evolutionary theory, which explores the concept of natural selection and its effects on biological evolution. Darwin explained the basic principles of natural selection. He states that each individual in the biological world survives in competition with other individuals, and that those individuals that adapt to their environment will be able to survive better in reproduction and pass on their advantages to their offspring. This inheritance is achieved through genetic inheritance, which creates the next generation that is better adapted to the environment. Second, Darwin explains how natural selection has driven the evolution of species. As the environment changes, certain individual traits become better adapted to the new environment and thus more likely to survive reproduction and be passed on to the next generation. These favorable traits gradually spread throughout the population, forming new species. In addition, Darwin discusses the constraints of natural selection, including genetic drift, genetic bottlenecks, sexual reproduction, mutations, and interspecific competition. He also discusses three forms of natural selection, namely directional selection, stable selection, and divergent selection, and the roles of these forms. The selection theory reveals that natural selection is one of the key mechanisms of biological evolution, and its basic principles are competition and adaptation, using the genetic transmission of adaptive advantages to form the next generation that is better adapted to the environment. The role of natural selection in the history of biological evolution cannot be ignored. In addition to natural selection, Darwin introduced another concept in the origin of species, namely intrinsic selection. Intrinsic selection refers to the traits or characteristics of an organism that help it gain an advantage in competition and thus a greater chance of reproduction. The role of intrinsic selectivity can be explained in several ways. First, intrinsic selectivity can promote the adaptability of an organism. Individuals can adapt to different environments through specific physiological mechanisms, behavioral patterns, or the use of ecological niches. These adaptive features can help organisms to be more competitive in natural selection and thus more likely to survive and reproduce. Second, intrinsic selectivity can also influence an organism's mate choice. Organisms typically select for mates with greater intrinsic selectivity because they are more likely to have better genetics and better adapted characteristics to their local environment. Such selection can somehow promote genetic stability and transmission, thereby enhancing population adaptability. Finally, intrinsic selection can also increase the diversity of populations through a certain degree of genetic drift. The characteristics of an organism may change slightly over time, and these changes may lead to the emergence of new characteristics and the disappearance of old ones. Such drift can make biological populations more diverse and thus increase the range of adaptability of biological populations. In summary, intrinsic selectivity is an adaptive characteristic of an organism that helps it to be more competitive in natural selection and thus more likely to survive and reproduce in future generations. This selectivity can be influenced by the mate choice, adaptability, and genetic diversity of an organism. Another important concept introduced in the origin of species is sexual selection. Sexual selection refers to an organism's preference for certain external characteristics or behaviors when choosing a mate. These characteristics or behaviors are often associated with reproduction, such as the beautiful tail feathers of male peacocks or the singing behavior of birds. The concept of sexual selection was introduced by Darwin, who believed that sexual selection was another important driver of evolution. Sexual selection plays a crucial role in the evolution of morphology and the emergence of sexual dimorphism. In sexual selection, the external features of male individuals become more colorful, exaggerated, and dazzling to attract the attention of females. Over time, females develop a preference for these characteristics, which makes them more common and accelerates the evolution of male physical characteristics. There are two aspects of sexual selection: competition and preference. Competition refers to the various behaviors and external characteristics that males display among themselves in order to gain reproductive rights. These behaviors and traits exist to attract the attention of female individuals in order to win reproductive rights. Preference refers to the preference that females show when choosing a mate. They select males with certain traits or behaviors as mates, which facilitates the evolution and transmission of these traits. Sexual selection plays an important role in many animal groups, such as birds, reptiles, and mammals. It plays an important role in the formation and maintenance of sexual dimorphism and sexual heterozygosity. Sexual selection contributes to a variety of external features and behaviors that are critical to the survival and reproduction of living organisms. In conclusion, the concept of sexual selection as presented in The Origin of Species is another important driver in biological evolution. Through competition and preference, it can lead to the diversification and evolution of external characteristics and behaviors, thus affecting the reproduction and adaptability of living organisms. Another force of selection mentioned in The Origin of Species is artificial selection. Artificial selection refers to the use of human means to select and breed specific species of plants and animals. Selection is usually based on certain distinctive breed characteristics, such as size, reproductive ability, coat color, etc. Human selection has been occurring for thousands of years. The most obvious example is agriculture and animal husbandry. Farmers and stock breeders select the best breeds to breed and grow in order to obtain higher yields and better quality. This process of artificial selection is gradual, starting with the selection of better seeds or animals, and later using genetic propagation techniques to artificially adjust certain characteristics. The results of selection are usually predictable and controllable. This is in contrast to natural selection, which is usually unconscious and can produce unintended consequences. The purpose of artificial selection is to produce better varieties that will satisfy human needs, such as food, textile materials, medicine, and so on. In addition, artificial selection can also be used to breed pets, such as dogs and cats. However, there are some negative effects of artificial selection. For example, overemphasis on certain traits in the breeding process may lead to the weakening of other traits, which in turn may affect the survival of the species. In addition, artificial selection may also lead to the decline of some species because they lack the ability to adapt to the natural environment. Overall, artificial selection is a powerful tool that can be used to improve and create new species. However, artificial selection must be carried out carefully to avoid negative impacts on biodiversity and species survival. Furthermore, Darwin argues that all existing organisms evolved from a common ancestor, called the primitive form. When organisms reproduce in nature, they mutate. If these mutations are beneficial to the survival and reproduction of the organisms, then they are more likely to survive and pass on these beneficial traits to the next generation. This process continues over a long period of time, and these variations accumulate during the evolutionary process, eventually leading to the creation of different species. Thus, Darwin argues that the origin of species is driven by natural selection and species variation. Darwin further proposed his common ancestor theory, which suggests that all existing organisms can be traced back to a common ancestor, which may itself be a very simple organism. This theory is one of the foundations of modern biology and one of the key conclusions of biologists' studies of the evolutionary process. Darwin also addresses the issue of species classification. He discussed the existing classification system and put forward his own views. He argues that species should be classified according to their evolutionary history and common ancestry, rather than simply by their appearance or other characteristics. In his book, Darwin introduces many different classification systems, including the now obsolete anthropological classification system. He points out that these systems have some flaws and are not entirely scientifically reliable. He proposes his own taxonomic system, which classifies species into genera, families, orders, phyla, and kingdoms, and bases the classification on the evolutionary history of these units. In this section, Darwin also explains the meaning and importance of taxonomy. He points out that classification can help us better understand the relationships between species and their evolutionary history. It can also help us discover new species and better understand their ecosystems. One of the foundations of modern biology is the tree-like classification proposed in The Origin of Species, also known as the Darwin tree. This classification classifies species into different evolutionary branches based on their evolutionary relationships. Evolutionary branches are groups of species that evolved from a common ancestor and can be identified by comparing their morphological, genetic, and physiological characteristics. The formation of dendroclassification dates back to the 18th century, when scientists classified organisms by comparing their morphology. In the mid-19th century, evolutionary theory emerged to bring new ideas to species classification. The theory of natural selection proposed in Darwin's book Origin of Species provided a scientific explanation for the evolution of organisms. This theory holds that species are constantly changing and developing through evolution and natural selection. The tree classification method is based on this theory. It analyzes the evolutionary relationships between different species by comparing their commonalities and differences, and represents them as a tree diagram. In this way, biologists can better understand the evolutionary history of species, speculate on their origins and evolutionary processes, and study their taxonomic relationships. The formation of tree taxonomy has not only contributed to the development of biology, but also had an important impact on the study of other disciplines. For example, it has provided the basis for biogeography, ecology, and evolutionary biology, and has become one of the most important tools in modern biology. The taxonomic section of The Origin of Species illustrates very important concepts and principles in modern biology. It provides an important guide for understanding the evolutionary history of organisms and for better preserving biodiversity. In this section of The Origin of Species, Darwin explores the geographic distribution of species, an important aspect of his research. He found that there are similarities and differences among species in different regions and that these features can be used to infer their evolutionary history. According to Darwin, the distribution of species can be explained as a result of geographic isolation and evolution. For example, when species in a region are isolated, they may evolve independently, developing unique characteristics and adaptations. This is why many species on islands have unique characteristics and adaptations. In addition, Darwin describes the distribution of dispersed species, which can be widely distributed across multiple areas. He suggests that the distribution of these species can be attributed to their ability to adapt to different environments and may be influenced by biogeographic factors such as continental drift and sea level change. The section on geographic distribution in The Origin of Species illustrates the link between geographic isolation and evolution and provides a guide to understanding the relationships among species. It also highlights the similarities and differences among species, which are important factors to consider when studying the evolutionary history of organisms. The geological record section of The Origin of Species explores the support of fossil evidence from Earth for theories of biological evolution. Darwin recognizes that fossils are direct evidence of the biological world of the past and that they can help us understand past patterns of biodiversity and evolution. In The Origin of Species, Darwin mentions many fossil finds, including fish, reptiles, and mammals. He notes that fossil occurrences often correspond to stratigraphic distributions, suggesting that biomes at different times had different compositions and evolutionary histories. These findings suggest that the evolution of biomes was gradual, with different species appearing and disappearing at different points in time. In addition, Origin of Species elaborates on Darwin's fossil remains hypothesis, which states that the ancestry of modern organisms can be traced through fossil evidence. Darwin argues that fossils can provide information about the evolution of organisms at different times and the evolutionary relationships between different species, which can help us deduce the evolutionary history of modern organisms. The importance of fossils to the theory of biological evolution is emphasized in the geological record section of The Origin of Species. Fossils provide direct evidence to support the gradual process of species evolution and biomes at different time periods. In addition, Darwin's fossil remains hypothesis provides an important way to trace the evolutionary history of organisms. Darwin also describes several important events in Earth's history, including the formation of the Earth, geological changes, and the emergence and evolution of life. These events have had a profound impact on the evolution and distribution of species. Darwin mentions geological changes on Earth, such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and sea level changes, which can provide new opportunities and challenges for the evolution and distribution of species. For example, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions can cause the migration and isolation of species, while changes in sea level can create new land or islands that provide new habitats. In addition, Darwin introduced the fossil record, which is one of the most direct pieces of evidence in the geological record. Fossils can provide important information about paleontology and paleogeography, such as the evolutionary route of species, places of origin, and migration routes. Through the study of the fossil record, we can better understand the evolution and distribution of species. In addition to the fossil record, Darwin also focused on the geological history of the Earth. For example, he mentions plate movements and mountain building movements during the Paleozoic period, which had a major impact on the topography and geomorphology of the Earth's surface, as well as on the evolution and distribution of species. In the geological transformation section of The Origin of Species, Darwin highlights the influence of major events in Earth history on the evolution and distribution of species. These events not only formed the context for the evolution and distribution of species, but also directly or indirectly influenced the direction and rate of species evolution. In The Origin of Species, Darwin proposed the idea of relative motion and geographical distribution to explain many phenomena in biogeography. Relative motion refers to the movement and drift of continental plates, which is an important phenomenon in the history of the Earth. The movement and drift of continental plates have led to the formation and change of mountains, rivers, oceans, and other landforms on Earth. These landform changes directly affect the migration and distribution of organisms. By studying geographic distribution, Darwin discovered a number of biomes associated with geographic location. The distribution of these biomes is closely related to their status and ecological niche in each region. This relationship between geographic distribution and ecological niche provides some evidence for Darwin's evolutionary theory. For example, in South America and Australia, there are many species of kangaroo. Darwin suggests that these kangaroo species are similar because they live in similar environments and their ancestors migrated from the same place at different times. Darwin also noted that the terrestrial mammals of South America and Australia are very different from those of other continents. He proposed the hypothesis that the distribution of these organisms was related to continental drift, and this hypothesis provided an important idea for the development of geology and biogeography. Therefore, Darwin's theory of relative motion and geographic distribution is an important research direction in the field of biogeography and an important theoretical basis for the fields of evolutionary biology and geology. In The Origin of Species, Darwin described in detail the interactions between adaptation and change of organisms. Organisms need to adapt in a changing environment, and this adaptation is a driving force for biological evolution. Evolution is the result of genetic mutations that make certain individuals more suitable for survival and reproduction, thereby passing on such adaptive genes in the population, which in turn affects the evolution of the species as a whole. Darwin uses many examples to illustrate the interactions between biological adaptation and change. He describes how adaptations and changes in the environment of many different species, such as birds, insects, and mammals, have led to their evolution. He also presents examples of researchers' successes in artificial selection that demonstrate how humans can change the genetic composition of entire populations by selecting certain individuals. In addition, Darwin explained why some biological features appear similar in different species. He suggests that these similarities are due to the fact that different species faced similar adaptive challenges in similar environments and independently evolved similar traits from these challenges. The interactions between adaptation and change and their importance for evolution are described in detail in The Origin of Species. These insights remain fundamental to the study of biology today and have had a profound impact on our understanding and conservation of biodiversity. The theory of natural selection proposed in The Origin of Species caused a great deal of controversy at the time and was even considered to be a challenge to the idea of God's creation. However, it was also supported by many scientists of the time, most notably Charles Lyell, a geologist and friend of Darwin, and Thomas Henry Huxley, a zoologist. Prior to this theory, the study of natural science often involved a search for teleology or final causes, i.e., an attempt to answer why the creature exists or why it possesses certain physiological characteristics. Natural selection theory, however, shifts attention to more realistic and observable processes of biological adaptation and change. Natural selection theory asserts that in any given natural environment, the adaptive and reproductive capacities of individuals are different. In such an environment, the more adaptive individuals are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on their superior genes. This process continues and leads to the evolution of the species as a whole. This theory provides a more realistic and observable explanation for why different species have different characteristics and behaviors. It breaks with some conventional thinking and allows scientists to focus more on the similarities and variability among species rather than on their purpose or ultimate cause. In addition, natural selection theory has largely explained the adaptability of species. Species are able to survive and reproduce in the environment because they have characteristics that are compatible with the environment. During evolution, these characteristics are gradually generated by genetic variation and selection. The concept of natural selection was not unknown before Darwin, but Darwin gained an in-depth understanding of natural selection through extensive research and observation. In The Origin of Species, Darwin describes how natural selection works, and he argues that natural selection arises through biological variation and evolution. Throughout the book, Darwin provides a wealth of evidence to support the concept of natural selection, including observations on artificial selection, animal morphology, and biogeography. Through his study of integrated natural science, Darwin understands the relationships between various organisms. He gained insight into natural selection through the study of artificial selection. When people choose to breed, they often select favorable traits for mating. This behavior helps species evolve and create more favorable morphology to adapt to new environments. Similarly, natural selection allows organisms to evolve to produce more favorable traits in response to changes in the environment. In the book, Darwin also explains the concept of natural selection through the morphology of animals. He finds that the body morphology of different species varies greatly, and that these morphologies are closely related to their habitats. For example, creatures like birds and insects have feathers and wings that help them fly through the air to avoid natural enemies on the ground. These morphological differences are the result of natural selection, and these features often evolve over generations. Darwin also explained the concept of natural selection through biogeography. He found that species vary greatly from region to region and that the occurrence of these species is related to geography. For example, species in places like South America and Australia, which are far away from other places, are very different. In The Origin of Species, Darwin also mentions the problem of missing geological records. The geological record is an important basis for the history of the Earth, but over long periods of time, geological processes and climatic conditions at the Earth's surface may have resulted in the loss or failure to preserve large numbers of fossils. Moreover, when fossils are preserved, they are not always intact because they are easily destroyed by geologic processes or are in poor condition. Therefore, fossils in the geologic record represent only part of the evolutionary history of organisms, and sometimes misunderstandings arise because of incomplete records. For example, there are a large number of organisms on Earth in some time periods, but our understanding of these organisms is relatively limited due to the poor state of preservation of the fossils. On the other hand, some of the more unusual features of organisms may be more difficult to represent in fossils and may result in missing geological records. Nevertheless, Origin of Species provides many valuable theories and perspectives that are still important to our understanding of the evolution of life. With the development of modern scientific techniques, such as molecular biology and genetics, our understanding of the evolution of life is constantly being expanded and deepened. In the book Origin of Species, Darwin proposed that the origin of species mainly comes from adaptation and variation. He argued that the adaptability and genetic variation of organisms in the environment would determine their chances of survival and reproduction, leading to the evolution and differentiation of species. This theory of Darwin was very controversial at that time because it was contrary to the prevailing religious beliefs, but with the advancement of science and technology and the efforts of scientists, this theory has gained more and more support and confirmation. In modern biology, the origin of species is attributed to two major mechanisms: natural selection and genetic drift. Natural selection refers to the selection of the adaptive capacity and genetic variation of an organism caused by environmental stress, which in turn affects the survival and reproduction of the organism. Genetic drift refers to the change in gene frequency due to random genetic variation and genetic funneling, which in turn affects the evolution and differentiation of species. The origin of species is a long process that requires long-term observation and research, as well as an in-depth understanding of the natural environment and biological species on Earth. Through the study of the origin of species, we can better understand the evolution and differentiation process of organisms, which is important for the protection of biodiversity and biological adaptability. The theory of selection is considered to be one of the key theories in the book Origin of Species. In addition, the book also focuses on the characteristics of organisms and the relationship between different species. First, the theory of selection is based on the fact that there is a process of natural selection in nature, which means that there are genetic differences in organisms, some of which allow them to adapt better to their environment and survive, and some of which do not. This process of natural selection allows the more adaptive genes to gradually dominate the species. In addition, the origin of species is one of the main points of the origin of species. In his book, Darwin suggests that the origin of species is a process driven by natural selection and genetic variation. Genetic variation in organisms makes individuals in a species different from individuals in other species, and this difference is gradually fixed by the process of natural selection, eventually forming new species. In addition, theories of selection and the origin of species have been applied to various fields of biology, such as human evolution and gene therapy. The theory of selection and the theory of the origin of species also became an important foundation of biology and influenced the development of biology. Finally, the Origin of Species book also describes the characteristics of organisms and the relationship between different species. The characteristics of organisms can be studied through anatomy, physiology, and embryology. The relationships between species can be studied through comparative anatomy and biogeography. These aspects of On the Origin of Species have become the basis of biology and have had an important influence on the development of modern biology. In The Origin of Species, Darwin proposed a theory of the origin of living organisms. He argued that life was initially produced by chemical reactions of simple organic substances, which subsequently evolved over a long period of time to form complex organisms. He called it primitive life or protozoa. In Origin of Species, Darwin did not elaborate on the origin of life, but he argued that the origin of life must follow the physical and chemical laws prevalent in nature, and that the right environment and conditions were needed. Subsequent scientific studies have shown that the process of the origin of life may have involved knowledge from a variety of fields, including astrophysics, geochemistry, and biochemistry. In the early history of the Earth, large amounts of inorganic material reacted chemically to form the organic material necessary for life, which in turn led to the formation of primitive life. This process may have involved complex biochemical reactions, such as the synthesis of amino acids and the formation of nucleotides. These biomolecules further evolved through self-replication and self-repair mechanisms to form single-celled organisms, which eventually evolved into complex multicellular organisms. Darwin's theory of the origin of organisms and the origin of species has had an important impact on subsequent research in biology and evolution. In modern biology, scientists have further explored the origin and evolution of organisms by means of molecular biology and genetics. They believe that the process of the origin of life may involve the interaction of several factors, including the ability of primitive life to replicate and repair itself, the synthesis of organic molecules, and the ability to adapt to the environment. The book Origin of Species, which describes the history of living organisms from the earliest fossils to the then known extant species, is also an important part of the study of evolutionary theory. In this section, Darwin discusses the origin of life on Earth and the process of evolution. Darwin argues that life began with simple cells that evolved over time to form more complex structures. He also describes the transitional fossils found in the fossil record, which show the evolution of organisms from one species to another and reveal the pattern and rate of evolution. In addition, Darwin described the diversity and distribution of organisms. He points out that organisms in different regions have their own unique characteristics and adaptations because they have evolved in different environments. He also discusses the competition between different species that evolved in the same environment and how this competition influenced their evolutionary direction. This section of the Origin of Species provides insight into the evolution of life on Earth, revealing the origin, evolutionary patterns, and diversity of living organisms, and outlining their adaptations and distributions. These theories and observations continue to influence the study of biology today. In The Origin of Species, the theory of selection has been applied extensively to the interpretation and understanding of many biological problems. One important application is to explain the behavior and social behavior of organisms. Selection theory can help explain why animals exhibit certain behaviors, such as courtship, offspring protection, and social establishment. It can also be used to explain the evolution of behavior and to predict possible future behavior. Another important application is in the study of human evolution. Choice theory can be used to explain the physiological and behavioral characteristics of humans, such as the evolution of the human brain and the development of human society. It can also be used to explain cultural and social aspects of human behavior, such as the evolution of morality and beliefs. Selection theory can also be used to explain biological adaptation and evolution. It can help scientists understand why certain organisms have specific characteristics and behaviors, and how they survive and reproduce in a changing environment. In addition, it can help predict the direction of evolution and possible evolutionary trends of organisms. In summary, selection theory is a fundamental and important theory in biology that can be used to explain many aspects of organisms, from behavioral and social behavior to the origin and evolution of organisms. By applying this theory, scientists can better understand the nature and evolution of organisms and anticipate possible future changes. Although the origin of species is mainly concerned with the evolution and diversity of species, the origin and evolution of life is also mentioned in the process. In ancient times, the environment on Earth was very different from today, lacking modern atmospheric gases such as oxygen, and concepts such as biological and food chains did not exist. There are many different hypotheses and theories about the origin of life in the past, but in contemporary scientific research, the main concern is the process of natural selection and biological evolution. In the process of natural selection and biological evolution, the adaptive capacity of organisms gradually increases, and the diversity of life gradually increases with time. This evolutionary process is very long, taking hundreds of millions of years, and requires the action of various natural forces, including the Earth's environment and climate change. According to scientific research, the origin of life can be traced back to about billions of years after the formation of the Earth, and the evolution of life has continued until now. In addition to research on the origin and evolution of life, some scientists are also exploring how to discover life on other planets similar to Earth. In this regard, scientists have focused on the conditions and requisites for life, such as water and chemical elements, and have also explored possible adaptation strategies and evolutionary pathways. The Origin of Species, a landmark work by Darwin, introduced the concept of natural selection and explored it in depth through systematic exposition and rich illustrations. He argues that natural selection is the fundamental driver of biological evolution, that variability among individuals and fecundity are the two main factors in biological evolution, and that selection in the natural environment is another important factor in the process of biological evolution. In this book, Darwin demonstrates the far-reaching effects of natural selection on biological evolution through numerous examples, including explanations of species variation, the formation of adaptive and non-adaptive features, the origin and classification of different species, geographic distribution and geological records, and many other aspects. In addition, he introduces important concepts such as selection theory and intrinsic selectivity, thereby enriching the understanding of biological evolution and the natural world. Although the publication of The Origin of Species was once widely controversial, over time more and more scientists and researchers began to accept and apply Darwin's theory, which had a profound impact on the study of biological evolution and the natural world. To this day, natural selection remains one of the indispensable theoretical foundations of biological evolution and ecological research, and provides valuable ideas and tools for understanding the wonders of the natural world.